The cold Moscow wind cut through Lieutenant Alexander Petrov's coat as he stood on the frozen dockyard of Arkhangelsk Harbor on January 12, 1942. As the Soviet logistics officer responsible for documenting Lend-Lease arrivals, he had seen many American shipments before, but nothing had prepared him for what was now materializing through the morning fog. An endless procession of Studebaker US6 trucks, not dozens or even hundreds, but thousands upon thousands, rolled off the Liberty ships in perfect formation. The convoy stretched beyond his field of vision, disappearing into the mist like a mirage of industrial might. Petrov consulted his manifest again, certain there must be some error in translation. 30,000 trucks, the document read. First shipment. His hands trembled slightly as he compared the figure to Stalin's original request to President Roosevelt just 3 months earlier. 500 trucks monthly was all the Soviet leadership had dared to ask for. What Petrov witnessed now was not merely a generous interpretation of that request, it was an industrial response so overwhelming that it defied 60 years of Marxist-Leninist teachings about capitalist production capabilities. The sound of engines filled the air, not the irregular, strained noise of Soviet machinery, but a unified, confident hum that spoke of precision engineering and abundant fuel. "Impossible," muttered Commissar Khrushchev, who stood beside him, his face a mask of disbelief. "We would need 20 factories working for 6 months to produce this many vehicles." What the two men saw that morning defied 25 years of Soviet propaganda about American industrial weakness and capitalist inefficiency. As the trucks continued to roll off the ships, each one identical, each one full of spare parts and fuel, Petrov realized he wasn't simply witnessing a delivery. He was witnessing the mathematics of Soviet defeat in the race of production. Had Germany chosen America as its enemy instead of Russia? In his logbook, with hands still shaking, he wrote what would later become famous words in Soviet military circles. "The Americans don't simply have more than us. They have more than they themselves know what to do with." The Soviet Union had been fighting a war of desperate shortages, where every truck, every tank, every rifle was precious. What Petrov saw that January morning was something else entirely. A nation that could afford to give away more trucks in a single shipment than the entire Red Army possessed on the Eastern Front. The Soviet understanding of the United States had been shaped by years of careful propaganda. From the early 1920s, Soviet citizens were taught that America was a nation of stark contradictions, immense wealth for a few capitalists, grinding poverty for the workers, and an industrial base that, while impressive in peacetime, would crumble under the pressures of war. The Great Depression had seemed to confirm this narrative. Images of breadlines in New York and unemployed workers in Detroit were regular features in Soviet newspapers. Throughout the 1930s, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, the Red Army found itself in desperate straits. Despite having one of the world's largest military forces on paper, Soviet logistics were in shambles. The purges of the 1930s had decimated the officer corps, removing experienced commanders and replacing them with politically reliable but militarily incompetent leaders. The Soviet transportation network, already strained by the demands of Stalin's 5-year plans, buckled under the weight of wartime demands. Most critically, the Soviet Union lacked motorized transport. While the propaganda newsreels showed impressive columns of trucks and tanks, the reality was that the Red Army relied heavily on horse-drawn wagons for much of its logistics. By September 1941, with German forces approaching Moscow, the situation had grown desperate. Soviet industrial capacity, impressive as it was, could not keep pace with the losses at the front. Factories were being physically relocated east of the Ural Mountains, away from the advancing German forces, an unprecedented industrial migration that saw entire manufacturing plants dismantled, transported by rail, and reassembled in new locations. It was against this backdrop that Stalin made his initial request to Roosevelt for Lend-Lease aid. The original request was modest by American standards: 500 trucks per month, 100 fighter aircraft, and various raw materials. Stalin, guided by his understanding of American capabilities as reported by Soviet intelligence and colored by Marxist economic theory, believed this request was substantial, perhaps even excessive. Soviet economists had calculated that American industry, despite its size, would struggle to meet such demands while also equipping its own growing military. What Soviet intelligence failed to grasp was the sheer scale and adaptability of American industry. Even before Pearl Harbor brought the United States officially into the war, American factories were retooling at an astonishing rate. The automobile industry, which had produced 3 million cars in 1940, was already converting to military production. Companies like General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler were transforming assembly lines that had built civilian vehicles into facilities that could produce tanks, aircraft, and military trucks. Major Ivan Konev, an industrial engineer by training, who served as a liaison between the Red Army and Lend-Lease officials, had predicted that America might be able to send perhaps 700 or 800 trucks monthly, an optimistic estimate that earned him criticism from party officials who deemed it unrealistic. When the first shipment of 30,000 trucks arrived in January 1942, Konev was summoned to explain this gross miscalculation. "I did not account for the American system of standardization," he admitted to a panel of senior officers. "They don't build trucks the way we build trucks. They don't measure production in pieces, but in minutes. At the Studebaker plant in South Bend, Indiana, they produce one complete truck every 7 minutes, 24 hours per day. Their assembly lines never stop." This revelation was met with skepticism bordering on disbelief. Colonel Georgy Zhukov, who would later rise to become one of the Soviet Union's most celebrated marshals, demanded documentation. "American propaganda," he called it. "No factory can produce at such rates without worker exhaustion and quality failures." The evidence, however, was rolling off the ships at Arkhangelsk and Murmansk in numbers that could not be dismissed. Each truck came with a complete set of spare parts, detailed maintenance manuals translated into Russian, and even extra tires, a luxury unheard of in the resource-starved Soviet military. More shocking still was the discovery that these trucks were not, as Soviet officials initially assumed, the totality of American production diverted to Lend-Lease. They represented less than 20% of monthly U.S. output. The Americans were sending the Soviet Union thousands of trucks, while simultaneously supplying their own rapidly expanding army and sending similar shipments to British forces. Lieutenant Petrov's duties expanded as the shipments continued to arrive. By March 1942, he had been promoted to captain and placed in charge of a new department dedicated solely to processing and distributing American Lend-Lease vehicles. His first significant task was to escort a convoy of 200 Studebaker US6 trucks from Arkhangelsk to Moscow, where they would be presented to Soviet military leadership as examples of American manufacturing. The journey, which took 7 days along poorly maintained roads, became Petrov's first intimate experience with American engineering. Unlike Soviet vehicles, which required constant maintenance and frequently broke down, the Studebakers performed flawlessly, despite the harsh conditions. When one truck developed a minor issue with its fuel pump, Petrov watched in amazement as the American-trained Soviet mechanic, Private Leonid Baranov, replaced the component in less than 15 minutes using standardized tools provided with the vehicle. In a Soviet truck, this would be a 2-day repair, Baranov explained, wiping grease from his hands. "We would need to fabricate parts, adjust fittings. With these American vehicles, every part fits exactly. Every truck is identical to the millimeter." This standardization represented a fundamental difference in industrial philosophy that few Soviet officials had fully appreciated before witnessing it firsthand. Soviet industry, despite its impressive output, still relied heavily on skilled craftsmen who could adjust and modify components to make them work together. American mass production, in contrast, depended on interchangeable parts manufactured to precise tolerances, an approach that sacrificed the appearance of craftsmanship, but delivered overwhelming advantages in speed of production and ease of maintenance. The convoy's arrival in Moscow created a sensation among military leaders. General Andrei Yermomenko, who had been fighting a desperate holding action against German forces with severely limited transport, walked slowly around one of the Studebakers, examining its construction with a critical eye. "The welding is uniform," he noted, running his hand along a seam. "Machine welded, not handcrafted. And look at the engine compartment. The components are not merely functional. They're arranged for ease of access and maintenance. This isn't just a vehicle. It's a complete system." Stalin himself inspected the American trucks, maintaining a stoic expression as his subordinates explained the vehicle's capabilities. According to witnesses, including Petrov, the Soviet leader asked only one question: how many more can they send? The answer, that America was prepared to ship tens of thousands more, reportedly left Stalin silent for several moments. Later, in a private meeting with his closest advisors, he made a comment that would not become public until decades later. They have 2 continents of resources, untouched by war, and a production system we cannot match. We must never face them as enemies. The impact of American trucks on Soviet military operations was immediate and profound. Before Lend-Lease, approximately 80% of Soviet artillery was moved by horse-drawn transport. By 1944, that figure had dropped to 30%, with American trucks taking over the bulk of logistical duties. This mechanization transformed Soviet tactical capabilities, allowing for faster movement of troops and supplies, more flexible responses to German offensives, and the ability to sustain longer advances when attacking. Private Dmitry Volkov, a driver in the 76th Rifle Division, kept a diary that offers a ground-level view of this transformation. In an entry dated June 3, 1943, he wrote, "Our battalion received 20 Studebakers today. The commissar gave a speech about Soviet-American friendship, but all we drivers cared about was getting our hands on these machines. They are like nothing we have ever driven, powerful, reliable, and filled with features our Soviet trucks lack. The other drivers and I spent hours exploring every compartment, every control. It feels like being given a tank after fighting with a rifle." The most significant advantage the American trucks offered was not merely their quantity, but their reliability. Soviet vehicles, chronically short of spare parts and often manufactured with poor quality materials due to wartime shortages, frequently broke down. American trucks, built with higher-grade steel and precision components, could operate for thousands of kilometers with minimal maintenance. This reliability transformed the Soviet approach to military logistics. Colonel Viktor Baranovsky, head of rear services for the 3rd Ukrainian Front, observed in a report to Moscow, "The American vehicles have changed our calculation of supply needs. Previously, we had to account for a 25% vehicle failure rate on any major movement. With the Studebakers, the failure rate drops to under 3%. This means smaller repair units, fewer spare parts, caravans, and more predictable arrival times for critical supplies." The American trucks came with another advantage that few had anticipated. They were designed for mass production, which made them easier to repair under battlefield conditions. Major Sergei Lanov, commander of a mobile repair unit, explained this in a training lecture to new mechanics in August 1943. Soviet vehicles are often individually crafted. Each component might need fitting and adjustment. The American trucks use a different philosophy. Every part is made to such precise measurements that they can be exchanged between vehicles without modification. A damaged truck can donate its parts to others, and those parts will fit perfectly. This is why American industry can produce such quantities. They build to a system, not to individual specifications. This concept of interchangeable parts represented more than a technical advantage. It reflected a fundamentally different approach to industrial organization that challenged Soviet assumptions. The USSR had achieved impressive production figures through heroic efforts, working people to exhaustion and accepting quality variations. The American system achieved even greater output through standardization, mechanization, and process efficiency, concepts that were theoretically part of Soviet industrial planning but rarely achieved in practice. The psychological impact on Soviet personnel exposed to American equipment was profound and multi-layered. Initial reactions often included disbelief, suspicion, and even resentment. Captain Ivan Golovko, a political officer attached to a truck battalion in 1943, described the challenge this presented to ideological training. "The men look at these American vehicles, then at our own, and they ask dangerous questions. Why can't we build trucks like these? If capitalism is so inefficient, how do they produce such quality in such quantities?" I try to explain that these vehicles represent exploitation of American workers, that each truck costs the suffering of a proletarian family. But the men see only the result, and the result is excellent. Political officers throughout the Red Army reported similar difficulties. The party line had always emphasized that Soviet technology, while perhaps lacking the polish of Western equivalents, was more robust, better suited to Russian conditions, and produced without capitalist exploitation. American trucks, which outperformed Soviet vehicles in every aspect, while arriving in seemingly limitless numbers, directly contradicted this narrative. General Vasily Zhukov, who would later lead the Soviet forces at addressed this ideological challenge pragmatically. Let the political officers worry about theory. For us commanders, the reality is simple. American trucks are keeping our armies moving and our soldiers fed. Without them, we would be fighting a very different war, perhaps even losing it. This candid assessment reflected a growing recognition among Soviet military leaders that Lend-Lease support, particularly in the form of logistics vehicles, was not merely helpful but essential to Soviet combat effectiveness. By 1943, American-supplied trucks constituted approximately 70% of the Red Army's total transport fleet. The invisible front of supply and transportation, often overlooked in accounts of battles and campaigns, had been largely Americanized. The scale of this logistical transformation becomes clear when examining the numbers. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States supplied the Soviet Union with approximately 427,284 trucks and jeeps, more vehicles than the Soviet Union had manufactured domestically during the entire war. For context, the entire pre-war Soviet truck park numbered about 145,000 vehicles. American industry had replaced and expanded this fleet nearly 3 times over. What made this achievement more remarkable was that it represented only a fraction of American production capacity. While sending hundreds of thousands of vehicles to the Soviet Union, U.S. factories were simultaneously equipping the rapidly expanding American military, supplying British and other Allied forces, and maintaining minimal civilian production. Studebaker alone produced over 197,678 US6 trucks during the war years, almost all of them destined for Lend-Lease shipment to the USSR, while still manufacturing components for aircraft and other war materials. This productive capacity extended far beyond vehicles. When Soviet officials requested specific modifications to trucks to better suit Russian road conditions and climate, American factories implemented these changes within weeks, a responsiveness that astonished Soviet procurement officers accustomed to bureaucratic delays. Colonel Nikolai Vatitin, who served as a liaison officer with American Lend-Lease administrators, described his visit to the Studebaker plant in South Bend, Indiana, in a classified report. The scale of production defies description. The main assembly building is over half a kilometer long. Inside, truck chassis move continuously along a conveyor system, never stopping as workers add components. A complete truck emerges every 7 minutes. When I explained our need for improved cold weather starting systems, the American engineers asked for specifications. 2 weeks later, modified vehicles were already being produced. This responsive capacity, the ability to adapt production quickly without disrupting the flow, is perhaps more impressive even than the volume of output. This adaptability reflected fundamental differences in how the two industrial systems operated. Soviet industry, despite its impressive achievements in heavy manufacturing, was hampered by rigid centralized planning that made rapid changes difficult. American industry, while coordinated for war production, maintained a flexibility and responsiveness that Soviet observers found both impressive and somewhat disorienting. The impact of American trucks extended beyond military operations. As the Red Army drove westward in 1943 and 1944, reclaiming Soviet territory and pushing into Eastern Europe, the logistics challenges multiplied. Railroads had been destroyed, bridges blown up, and roads damaged. In this context, the mobility provided by American trucks became even more crucial. Major Leonid Brezhnev, who served as a political commissar in the 18th Army and would decades later rise to lead the Soviet Union, supervised the movement of supplies through Ukraine in 1944. In his official reports, later published in heavily edited form in his memoirs, he noted, "The roads of Ukraine have been destroyed by the fascists. Railways operate only sporadically, where our engineers have repaired the tracks. In this situation, the trucks have become our lifeline. They move across fields when roads are impassable, ford small rivers where bridges have been destroyed, and operate day and night to keep our forces supplied. Without this mobility, our advances would halt within days as ammunition and food ran out." What Brezhnev did not mention in his public writings, but acknowledged in classified communications, was that this vital mobility depended almost entirely on American vehicles. Soviet trucks, with their less powerful engines and lower ground clearance, struggled in the muddy conditions of the Ukrainian spring. The Studebaker US6, with its six-wheel drive and robust construction, became the preferred vehicle for frontline supply operations. The psychological impact on German forces of witnessing this motorized abundance was also significant. Lieutenant Werner Haas, a Wehrmacht officer captured near Minsk in July 1944, described during interrogation his growing realization of Germany's strategic situation. In 1941 and early 42, we would destroy Soviet trucks and know they couldn't be easily replaced. Each vehicle eliminated was a small victory. By 44, the roads were filled with American trucks as far as you could see. Destroying one made no difference. There were always more. We began to understand that we weren't just fighting Russia, we were fighting America's factories. And that was a battle we could never win. This observation captures a fundamental truth about the war's industrial dimension. While German propaganda continued to highlight tactical victories and celebrated the superiority of German equipment, the strategic reality was increasingly shaped by sheer productive capacity, a contest in which the combined Soviet-American alliance held an insurmountable advantage. For Soviet soldiers who had endured the desperate early days of the war, when equipment shortages meant sharing rifles and ammunition was strictly rationed, the transformation was particularly stark. Sergeant Mikhail Gorbachev, who would decades later become the last leader of the Soviet Union but in 1944 was a young tank commander, described the change in a letter to his family. "You cannot imagine how different things are now. 2 years ago, we counted every shell, every liter of fuel. Now the supply trucks arrive continuously. We receive more ammunition in one delivery than we used to get in a month. American food comes in cans with easy opening devices, meat, cheese, even fruit. The abundance is such that sometimes I feel we are fighting in a different army than the one I joined in." 41. This abundance was not limited to frontline units. Throughout the Soviet rear areas, American trucks transformed civilian life as well. Collective farms received vehicles for agricultural use, improving food production at a critical time. Hospitals used modified truck chassis as mobile medical units. Construction brigades rebuilding damaged cities relied on American vehicles to transport materials. Colonel Alexei Kosygin, who supervised industrial reconstruction in liberated areas and would later serve as Soviet premier, documented this civilian impact in report to the State Defense Committee. "The American trucks have become the backbone of our reconstruction efforts. A single Studebaker can transport materials that would require 10 horse-drawn wagons. They operate on low-quality fuel, function in all weather conditions, and require minimal maintenance. We have been able to establish regular supply routes to isolated communities that would otherwise remain cut off." The psychological effect on the civilian population of seeing these reliable vehicles delivering food and materials cannot be overstated. It provides tangible evidence that the situation is improving. This transformation was not merely material but intellectual. Soviet engineers, mechanics, and drivers exposed to American vehicles were receiving an unplanned education in mass production techniques, standardization principles, and design philosophies that would influence Soviet industry for decades to come. Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Ustinov, who oversaw tank production during the war and would later rise to become Soviet defense minister, conducted a systematic study of American production methods as revealed through Lend-Lease equipment. His classified report, circulated among senior industrial managers in 1944, concluded, "The American advantage is not simply one of resources or scale, though these are significant. Their fundamental advantage lies in their approach to standardization, their production line organization, and their understanding that quantity has a quality all its own. A Soviet factory might produce better individual pieces through the skill of our workers, but the American system produces more functional pieces in a given time period. For a military struggling to equip millions of soldiers, the American approach proves superior." This reluctant recognition that Soviet industrial methods, despite 2 decades of 5-year plans and socialist competition, lagged behind. American techniques represented a significant psychological adjustment for Soviet leaders raised on a steady diet of propaganda about socialist productive superiority. The evidence was simply too overwhelming to ignore. By 1944, American trucks had become so ubiquitous in Soviet military operations that they were often taken for granted. General Ivan Petrov, no relation to the Lieutenant Petrov, who witnessed the first shipment, commanded the 4th Ukrainian Front during the Crimean Offensive. In his operational planning, he simply assumed the availability of motorized transport for rapid redeployment of forces, a capability that would have been unthinkable before Lend-Lease. American trucks gave us operational flexibility, previously reserved for German panzer units, he noted in a post-war analysis. We could concentrate forces quickly, exploit breakthroughs, and maintain supply lines during rapid advances. This mobility transformed how we fought the war. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact came through the education of a generation of Soviet military personnel in the principles of motorized logistics. Thousands of drivers, mechanics, and logistics officers received training on American equipment, absorbing not just technical knowledge but a different philosophy of military transportation. Major Rodion Malinovsky, who would later become Soviet defense minister, observed this educational process as a front commander. Our men learned more than how to drive American trucks. They learned about preventive maintenance schedules, about the importance of standardized parts, about the relationship between logistics and operational tempo. These lessons were not in any manual. They were absorbed through daily experience with equipment designed according to different principles than our own. This knowledge transfer extended to Soviet industry as well. As early as 1943, Soviet factories were studying captured American vehicles to understand their design and manufacturing techniques. The Gaz automobile plant in Gorky established a special department dedicated to analyzing American production methods, with the explicit goal of applying these lessons to Soviet manufacturing after the war. Engineer Pavel Jadonov, who headed this department, later wrote about the experience. We disassembled American trucks down to their smallest components. What impressed us most was not any particular technical innovation, but the consistent quality of every part. Every screw, every gear, every bearing met precise specifications. This standardization was the secret to American mass production, and it was something our industry had discussed theoretically, but never fully implemented. As the war progressed toward its conclusion, Soviet leaders began considering the implications of American productive capacity for the post-war world. The original Marxist-Leninist assumption had been that capitalism, despite periodic bursts of productivity, would ultimately prove less efficient than planned socialist economics. The war had provided a massive, unplanned experiment that challenged this assumption. Politburo member Vyacheslav Molotov, one of Stalin's closest advisors, addressed this ideological challenge in a closed session in February 1945. We must learn from the American industrial achievement without adopting their social system. Their productive techniques, standardization, assembly line organization, scientific management can be separated from capitalist ownership and incorporated into our socialist industrial model. The war has shown us both our strengths and our limitations. We must emerge from this conflict with a clear understanding of how to strengthen Soviet industry based on these lessons. This pragmatic approach, adopting American technical methods while maintaining the Soviet political and economic system, would characterize the immediate post-war period. Soviet factories, particularly those producing consumer goods and vehicles, began incorporating mass production techniques observed through Lend-Lease equipment. The ZIS automobile plant in Moscow, which resumed civilian truck production in 1946, implemented a number of American-inspired changes to its manufacturing process. Engineer Valentin Nikolaev, who had served as a maintenance officer for American vehicles during the war, described the transformation. Before the war, each truck was essentially built individually, with components fitted and adjusted by skilled workers. After studying American methods, we reorganized the factory to use interchangeable parts manufactured to precise tolerances. Production increased by 300% within 6 months, while quality improved and worker injuries decreased. The American trucks had taught us that mass production could be both more efficient and more precise than our traditional methods. The war's end brought additional challenges to Soviet ideological understanding. As American Lend-Lease deliveries wound down, Soviet propagandists faced the difficult task of explaining why American assistance, while appreciated, had not been decisive in the victory over fascism. The official narrative emphasized the heroism of Soviet workers and soldiers, while downplaying the significance of American material aid for those who had witnessed the transformation firsthand. However, the reality was more complex. Lieutenant Petrov, now promoted to colonel and serving in the Soviet occupation forces in Germany, reflected on his experience in a private diary entry dated October 3, 1945. Today, I watched as the last of the American trucks in our motor pool were prepared for return. Some will remain in Soviet service, but many are being sent back according to the Lend-Lease agreements. The drivers treated them almost as living things, patting their hoods and reminiscing about journeys taken together. These vehicles have become part of our victory, part of our story. The official newspapers speak of Soviet industrial might winning the war, and certainly our factories performed miracles. But I cannot forget that January morning in 1942, when I first saw those endless rows of Studebakers rolling off the ships. That sight changed something in my understanding of the world. This changed understanding would influence Soviet military and industrial development for decades to come. The post-war Soviet vehicle industry, while continuing to emphasize ruggedness and simplicity, incorporated many lessons from American manufacturing. The GAZ-51 truck, which became the backbone of Soviet civilian transportation in the 1950s, showed clear influences from the Studebaker designs Soviet engineers had studied during the war. More broadly, the experience of American material abundance during the war created lasting impressions on a generation of Soviet citizens who would later rise to leadership positions. Mikhail Gorbachev, Leonid Brezhnev, and many others who had witnessed American productive capacity firsthand carried these memories into the post-war period. This awareness of the gap between Soviet promises and American realities would contribute to the complex relationship between the superpowers during the Cold War. The legacy of American trucks in the Soviet Union extended far beyond the war years. In rural areas, modified Studebakers continued to serve as agricultural and transport vehicles well into the 1960s. Museums in Moscow, Leningrad, and other major cities included Lend-Lease vehicles in their exhibits about the Great Patriotic War, though their significance was often downplayed in the accompanying text. Veterans organizations maintained a more candid assessment. At reunions and private gatherings, former drivers and mechanics shared stories about their American vehicles, preserving a history that didn't always match official narratives. Nikolai Voronin, who had driven a Studebaker from Stalingrad to Berlin, expressed a sentiment common among these veterans. Politics is politics, but facts are facts. Without those American trucks, we would still have won the war, but at what additional cost in lives and time? They were the best vehicles I ever drove, before or since. That is not an ideological statement. It is simply the truth as I experienced it. This truth, that American industrial capacity had fundamentally altered the material conditions of the Soviet war effort, remained a complicated legacy for Soviet historical memory. It suggested limits to what the Soviet system could achieve on its own, contradicting decades of propaganda about socialist productive superiority. Yet it also demonstrated the potential for what Soviet industry might become if it could successfully adopt and adapt American manufacturing techniques. In the decades after the war, as Cold War tensions hardened ideological positions on both sides, the story of American trucks on Soviet roads faded from public discourse. Yet for those who had experienced this industrial revelation firsthand, from the soldiers who drove the vehicles to the engineers, who studied them to the generals, who planned operations around their capabilities, the memory remained vivid and consequential. Lieutenant Alexander Petrov, who witnessed that first massive shipment arrive in Arkhangelsk harbor, would rise to become a general in the Soviet Army before retiring in 1972. In his final official speech at a military academy graduation ceremony, he offered advice to the young officers that reflected his formative wartime experience. Learn from everyone. Study your opponents, not just for their weaknesses, but for their strengths. The greatest lesson of my generation was that no nation, no system, has a monopoly on good ideas or effective methods. Our victory in the Great Patriotic War came not just through heroism, though there was plenty of that, but through pragmatism, our willingness to acknowledge reality and adapt accordingly. That reality of an American industrial capacity that could produce 30,000 trucks as a first shipment in response to a request for 500 monthly had forced a generation of Soviet leaders to reconsider their understanding of the world. The trucks themselves eventually rusted away, but the lessons they brought to Soviet shores endured, shaping both military doctrine and industrial practice for decades to come. Today, in museums across the former Soviet Union, a few preserved Studebakers and other American vehicles stand as tangible reminders of this massive logistical operation. Visitors born long after the war often expressed surprise at learning the scale of American material assistance. For them, raised on stories emphasizing Soviet self-sufficiency, the revelation mirrors in small form the shock experienced by Lieutenant Petrov on that cold January morning in 1942, when he first glimpsed an industrial capacity beyond anything his ideology had prepared him to comprehend.
The small dairy farm on the outskirts of Passau, Germany, had fallen silent on April 12, 1945. Greta Hoffmann, a 19-year-old farm girl who had spent the entirety of the war tending to her family's livestock, while her brothers fought on the Eastern Front, stood frozen behind the weathered barn door. Through the narrow gap between splintered wooden planks, she watched with terror as 3 black American soldiers approached the farmhouse where her mother and younger sisters were preparing the meager evening meal. Her hands trembled as she gripped the pitchfork, her only defense against what she had been taught would be savage, animalistic behavior from these men. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted vivid, horrifying portraits of what would happen when the Negro soldiers arrived in German villages. The stories had become increasingly terrifying as the Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory. What Greta witnessed in the next 7 minutes would shatter 12 years of carefully cultivated indoctrination. The soldiers stopped at a respectful distance from the farmhouse. The tallest one, wearing lieutenant's bars, removed his helmet and spoke in perfect German to her frightened mother, who had appeared at the doorway clutching a kitchen knife. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Lieutenant William Morris from the 92nd Infantry Division. We're conducting a standard patrol of the area and checking on civilian welfare. Do you or your family need any medical assistance?" The German words flowed with the precision and confidence of an educated man. When her mother stood speechless, the soldier switched to English, then to French, then back to German, his linguistic abilities demonstrating years of formal education. Greta watched as the second soldier, noticing her youngest sister's persistent cough, reached into his pack and produced a bottle of antibiotics, explaining, again in passable German, the proper dosage. The third soldier kept a respectful distance, scanning a worn leather-bound book that Greta could eventually see was Goethe's Faust in its original German. What Greta saw defied 12 years of indoctrination and propaganda. These weren't the primitive savages she had been warned about. They were university-educated men whose knowledge and conduct betrayed the lies she had been raised to believe. The Deutschland Rundfunk had broadcast countless educational programs detailing the supposed primitive nature of black soldiers. Since 1933, when Hitler consolidated power, the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda had methodically constructed an image of black Americans as barely above animals, uneducated, uncultured, and driven by base instincts. Special pamphlets distributed to German girls warned specifically about the dangers these soldiers posed, describing them as a primitive subspecies of humanity, incapable of higher reasoning or civilized behavior. Posters depicting grotesque caricatures were displayed in schools, town halls, and youth group meetings. One particularly effective propaganda film, The Black Danger, had been shown in Greta's village just 3 months earlier, depicting American black soldiers as illiterate criminals released from prisons and forced into military service. This carefully constructed worldview began crumbling the moment Lieutenant Morris spoke. The lieutenant, as Greta would later learn, held a master's degree in Germanic languages from Howard University. The medic who offered antibiotics, Sergeant James Cooper, had been completing his medical studies at Meharry Medical College before being drafted. And the soldier reading Goethe, Private First Class Thomas Williams, had been an English literature professor at Morehouse College. These were not the beings described in Nazi propaganda. They were among the 371,000 black American servicemen deployed to the European theater, many of whom had advanced degrees and professional careers interrupted by the war. The propaganda had been strategic. The Nazi regime understood that controlling the German population's perception of Allied forces would strengthen resistance and prevent fraternization. Especially concerning to Nazi leadership was the potential impact of the 92,000 black soldiers who would eventually be stationed in Germany after the war. Reich propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels had personally overseen the creation of materials specifically designed to instill fear of black troops among the German civilian population. A directive from his ministry dated July 23, 1944, explicitly stated, "The German public must be conditioned to view Negro troops as a particular threat to the racial purity and physical safety of our women and children." What made this propaganda particularly effective was its targeted approach toward rural communities like Greta's village. Urban areas with universities and international connections before the Nazi rise to power had some limited exposure to black intellectuals, performers, and athletes during the Weimar Republic years. But in rural Bavaria, where Greta had spent her entire life, the only information about black people came directly from Nazi-controlled media. Her village of 763 residents had no library beyond the approved Nazi texts in the school, no access to foreign newspapers, and had been forbidden from owning radios capable of receiving foreign broadcasts since 1940. The isolation created perfect conditions for unchallenged indoctrination. For the previous 12 years, the education system had been fully aligned with Nazi racial ideology. Greta's school textbooks contained entire chapters explaining supposed racial hierarchies, with Nordic peoples at the top and various lesser races categorized below. One mandatory textbook, Biology for the German Student, included 27 pages detailing the purported intellectual limitations of black people, claiming they were cognitively incapable of mastering higher mathematics, complex language, or philosophical thinking. Her teachers had reinforced these lessons, sometimes conducting craniometry demonstrations, with measuring tapes and calipers to prove racial differences in skull size and shape, a pseudoscience that had been discredited decades earlier but was revived. Under Nazi racial theories, the Hitler Youth and League of German Girls, which Greta had been required to join at age 10, further reinforced these beliefs. Weekly meetings often included scientific presentations about racial characteristics and the dangers of racial mixing. By age 15, Greta and her peers had received over 700 hours of formal racial indoctrination through these youth organizations alone. This was in addition to the constant stream of propaganda through films, posters, radio programs, and public speeches. The narrative was consistent and unrelenting. Black people represented a primitive form of humanity, intellectually comparable to children, emotionally unstable, and driven primarily by animalistic urges. This context explains why Greta's worldview suffered such a profound shock upon encountering Lieutenant Morris and his men. The contradiction between what she had been taught and what she was witnessing created an almost physical sense of disorientation. The Nazi regime had invested enormous resources in creating a comprehensive worldview that now threatened to unravel in a single encounter. As German forces collapsed in the final months of the war, propaganda about black American soldiers had intensified. Specifically, warnings about sexual violence became more explicit, playing on fears that had been carefully cultivated for years. A pamphlet distributed to villages in the path of American advances claimed that 85% of Negro soldiers have criminal records for sexual offenses, a complete fabrication but one that resonated with the years of racial propaganda. The intent was clear: to make German civilians, especially women, view surrendering to American forces as a fate worse than continued resistance, regardless of how hopeless the military situation had become. What Greta could not have known on that April afternoon was that black American units had received specialized training about cultural sensitivity and civilian interaction, precisely because military leadership recognized the impact of Nazi propaganda. Unlike many white American units, black soldiers had been given explicit instructions about respectful behavior toward German civilians, proper protocols for entering homes, and the importance of maintaining professional demeanor at all times. This was not merely about countering propaganda. It reflected the reality that black soldiers understood their conduct would be scrutinized more harshly than that of their white counterparts. The 92nd Infantry Division, known as the Buffalo Soldiers, to which Lieutenant Morris and his men belonged, had one of the highest educational levels of any American combat unit. Nearly 37% of its officers held advanced degrees, compared to 23% in comparable white units. This was partly because black professionals from all fields had fewer exemptions from military service than their white counterparts. Black physicians, attorneys, engineers, and educators found themselves drafted at higher rates, creating what one military historian would later call possibly the most intellectually overqualified combat division in American military. History: Lieutenant Morris's patrol left additional medical supplies and food rations before continuing their sweep through the village. They promised to return the following day to check on the family and bring a doctor for Greta's sister if her condition worsened. As they departed, Greta remained hidden, her mind racing to reconcile what she had witnessed with the beliefs that had shaped her entire understanding of the world. She had been prepared for brutality, for the behaviors described in countless propaganda pieces. Instead, she had seen compassion, professionalism, and unmistakable evidence of advanced education. The following morning, Greta's mother sent her to deliver fresh milk to the American checkpoint established at the village crossroads. Her mother's reasoning was practical. Greta spoke some English from her school lessons, unlike her mother. But for Greta, the half-mile walk became a journey through a psychological minefield. Each step was taken with the expectation that the behavior she had witnessed the previous day had been an anomaly, that the true nature of these soldiers would reveal itself. She carried the milk jug with trembling hands, rehearsing the few English phrases she knew. Upon reaching the checkpoint, Greta encountered not only Lieutenant Morris's patrol, but a dozen other black American soldiers coordinating the distribution of emergency rations to village residents. A field kitchen had been established, producing more food in a single morning than many in the village had seen in months. Staff Sergeant Walter Reynolds, the mess officer, was explaining to a group of elderly villagers how to properly prepare the powdered milk and dehydrated eggs that were being distributed. He switched between broken German and fluent English, occasionally consulting a German-English dictionary when technical terms were needed. What caught Greta's attention, however, was not merely the abundance of food. It was the casual way these soldiers handled items that had become almost mythical in scarcity-stricken Germany. A young private absent-mindedly tossed an entire chocolate bar to a village child after taking only a single bite. Another soldier used white bread, real white bread, not the sawdust-supplemented gray bread Germans had subsisted on, to wipe his plate before discarding half the slice. When a can of peaches was found to be slightly dented, it was set aside rather than consumed. This casual abundance stood in stark contrast to Greta's family's existence, where every crumb was saved, where meals had been carefully rationed for years, and where her mother still maintained a secret tin containing 3 sugar cubes for absolute emergencies. As Greta delivered the milk, Lieutenant Morris recognized her from the previous day's patrol. "Ah, you must be the eldest daughter. Your mother mentioned you speak some English." His German was precise, with only a slight accent. Greta managed a stiff nod, still processing the contradictions before her. Sensing her discomfort, the lieutenant switched to English, speaking slowly to accommodate her limited understanding. "I studied German literature at Howard University before the war. Heine was my specialty. Do you know his works?" The question itself contained multiple shocks. First, that this man had attended university, something Greta had been taught was intellectually impossible for black people. Second, that he was familiar with Heinrich Heine, whose books had been among those burned in the Nazi purges of un-German literature. And third, that he assumed she might have read Heine, treating her as an intellectual equal rather than a simple farm girl. The cognitive dissonance was so severe that Greta found herself unable to form a coherent response. Sergeant Cooper, the medic, approached with a medical kit. "How's your sister today? Has her cough improved?" Again, the question came in carefully pronounced German. When Greta explained that her sister's condition remained unchanged, the sergeant immediately offered to accompany her back to the farm. "I completed 3 years of medical school before being drafted," he explained as they walked. "Pediatrics was going to be my specialty." This casual reference to advanced medical training contradicted everything in Greta's Nazi education, which had explicitly taught that black people lacked the intellectual capacity for medical science. At the farmhouse, Sergeant Cooper conducted a thorough examination of 8-year-old Elsa, displaying the confident competence of advanced medical training. He diagnosed her with bronchitis, likely exacerbated by malnutrition, and provided a course of antibiotics from his medical supplies. His interaction with the child was gentle and professional, his explanations to Greta's mother clear and detailed. Before leaving, he wrote precise instructions for the medication in perfect German handwriting, adding his signature, James Cooper, M.D., incomplete. That signature, its implicit claim to medical credentials, provoked Greta's first direct challenge. "But how can you be a doctor?" "We were taught that—" She stopped herself, suddenly aware of the offensive nature of what she had been about to say. Sergeant Cooper's response was measured, displaying an awareness of the propaganda that had shaped her beliefs. "I know what you were taught about people who look like me. Before the war, I was in my 3rd year at Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee. I had completed rotations in internal medicine, surgery, and was beginning pediatric studies when I was drafted." He reached into his pocket and produced a worn photograph showing him in a white laboratory coat, standing with other medical students. "That's my class at Meharry. 15 of us were drafted for the war effort. The remaining 12 are probably physicians now." The photograph presented evidence that directly contradicted years of indoctrination. Here was tangible proof, not merely words, but an image from a world that, according to everything Greta had been taught, could not possibly exist. The Nazi educational materials had been explicit. Black Americans lived in primitive conditions, received minimal education, and worked almost exclusively as manual laborers. The idea of black medical colleges, black physicians, black university professors, these concepts had been presented as literal impossibilities, equivalent to claiming that horses could solve mathematics or dogs could compose poetry. Over the next 3 weeks, as American forces established more permanent positions in the area, Greta's education continued through daily interactions. The division's chaplain, Captain Isaiah Jefferson, had been a theology professor with a doctorate from Boston University. The communications officer, First Lieutenant Robert Lawrence, held an electrical engineering degree from Howard University and could disassemble and reassemble radio equipment with remarkable speed and precision. Even the company cook, Corporal Henry Wilson, casually mentioned his pre-war studies in hotel management at what he called a small college in Atlanta, which Greta would later learn was the internationally respected Morehouse College. Each of these encounters added to the growing weight of evidence against everything Greta had been taught about black Americans. But perhaps the most significant revelation came when the division established a small library and educational center in the village's former Nazi Party headquarters. Captain Marcus Peterson, the division's education officer, had been an elementary school principal in civilian life with a master's degree in education from Columbia University. He organized a collection of books, including German language texts, and established English lessons for interested villagers. Greta cautiously joined these classes, driven by curiosity that was gradually overwhelming her ingrained fears. On the classroom wall hung a large map of the United States, with markers indicating the locations of historically black colleges and universities. Captain Peterson pointed to them one by one, describing each institution's founding, specialties, and notable alumni. Howard University, Tuskegee Institute, Fisk University. Morehouse College, Spelman College, names that meant nothing to Greta, but represented a parallel educational universe that Nazi propaganda had completely erased from her awareness. At Howard alone, Captain Peterson explained, there are more than 2,000 black students pursuing degrees in everything from medicine to engineering to fine arts. He showed photographs of campus buildings, laboratories, libraries, and graduates in academic regalia. These institutions were founded after the Civil War to ensure educational opportunities for formerly enslaved people and their descendants. My grandfather was born into slavery but graduated from Howard in 1897. My father was a physician. I was expected to pursue at least a master's degree from the time I could walk. The existence of these educational institutions represented a particularly devastating blow to Nazi racial ideology. The regime had not merely claimed that black people were intellectually inferior, they had presented this as an immutable biological fact, as certain as gravity. The evidence before Greta now suggested one of two possibilities. Either everything she had been taught was a deliberate lie, or the men she was encountering were extraordinary exceptions. The latter explanation became increasingly untenable as more black soldiers rotated through the village, many displaying similar levels of education and professional accomplishment. For Greta and other villagers, this growing awareness created profound psychological dissonance. The natural human tendency, when faced with evidence that contradicts deeply held beliefs, is to reject or rationalize the conflicting information. Some older villagers attempted this, suggesting that these black soldiers must be special specimens, or that they were merely repeating phrases and behaviors they had been taught to mimic. But such explanations collapsed under the weight of daily interactions that demonstrated not just memorized knowledge, but critical thinking, creativity, and intellectual flexibility. Greta's younger sister Elsa, less thoroughly indoctrinated due to her age, adapted more quickly. By the second week of the American presence, she was following Sergeant Cooper on his medical rounds, watching intently as he treated minor ailments among villagers and soldiers alike. Cooper, recognizing her interest, began explaining basic medical concepts, teaching her to wrap bandages and organize his supplies. For Elsa, there was no cognitive barrier to accepting that this kind, knowledgeable man could be exactly what he appeared to be, a skilled medical professional temporarily in uniform. The transformation of Greta's thinking progressed more gradually, marked by moments of resistance, followed by reluctant acceptance of new realities. A significant breakthrough came during the third week after the Americans' arrival. Lieutenant Morris had established a small collection of books in English and German, available for borrowing by both soldiers and villagers. Greta, whose English was improving through daily lessons, cautiously asked to borrow a volume of poetry. Morris selected Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, with parallel German translations. Whitman understood something essential about democracy and human dignity, Morris explained as he handed her the book. He saw America not as perfect, but as a project, an ongoing effort to create a society where birth circumstances wouldn't determine destiny. He showed her his own personal copy of Goethe's works, margins filled with careful annotations in elegant handwriting. I was comparing Whitman's and Goethe's conceptions of individual potential. My master's thesis argued that both saw human capacity as nearly limitless when properly nurtured. This casual reference to his academic work, coupled with the evidence of his intellectual engagement with complex literary theory, directly contradicted the most fundamental aspect of Nazi racial teaching, that black people were intellectually incapable of abstract thought and theoretical analysis. Morris wasn't simply educated in the sense of having accumulated information. He was engaged in the kind of high-level analytical thinking that Nazi ideology had explicitly described as biologically impossible for non-Aryans. As Greta read the poetry collection over subsequent days, she found Morris's annotations thought-provoking and insightful. His analysis of Whitman's imagery revealed a sophisticated understanding of literary techniques and philosophical underpinnings. She began asking questions about passages she found difficult, engaging in literary discussions that would have been unimaginable weeks earlier. During one such conversation, she finally asked the question that had been forming since their first encounter: "Why didn't you hate us when you arrived? After all the terrible things Germany said about your people, after fighting against German soldiers, how could you treat us with kindness?" Morris considered the question carefully before responding. "Education teaches us to distinguish between governments and people, between propaganda and reality. I studied enough German history to know that your country produced Beethoven and Goethe long before it produced Hitler. And I've lived enough American history to know that people often aren't responsible for the lies they've been taught." He paused, then added, "Besides, treating you with dignity was the most powerful way to disprove those lies." This conversation marked a turning point in Greta's understanding. The realization that Morris could empathize with her position, that he could comprehend the forces that had shaped her beliefs while simultaneously working to change them, through example rather than accusation, demonstrated a level of psychological sophistication and emotional intelligence that Nazi propaganda had specifically denied was possible in black individuals. According to the Reich's racial theories, black people were supposedly governed by emotion rather than intellect, incapable of the complex moral reasoning Morris was demonstrating. As April turned to May, the evidence of black intellectual achievement became increasingly difficult for even the most indoctrinated villagers to deny. The division established a small musical ensemble that performed weekly concerts, including works by black composers like William Grant Still and Harry T. Burleigh, alongside European classical pieces. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams, who had studied at Juilliard before the war, conducted these performances with obvious expertise, explaining the historical and musical context of each piece to the assembled villagers. Duke Ellington's compositions, Williams told the audience before one performance, represent a uniquely American classical tradition, blending European orchestral techniques with African rhythmic structures and harmonic innovations. This casual demonstration of musical theory, delivered by a man who, according to Nazi racial categorizations, should have been capable of only the most primitive musical expressions, further eroded the foundations of the villagers' indoctrination. The division's engineering unit provided perhaps the most pragmatic challenge to Nazi racial theories. When spring flooding threatened the village, Lieutenant Charles Davidson, who held a civil engineering degree from Prairie View A&M University, organized a sophisticated flood control operation. Under his direction, soldiers and villagers constructed a system of levees and drainage channels based on hydraulic principles that Davidson explained in detailed technical terms. His ability to calculate water flow rates, material requirements, and structural specifications, all complex mathematical operations that Nazi racial theory had explicitly claimed were beyond black intellectual capacity, was demonstrated not through argument, but through successful, practical application. By the end of May 1945, the accumulated evidence had created an insurmountable challenge to the racial worldview that had been systematically constructed in Greta's mind since childhood. Each day brought new contradictions to Nazi teachings, not through propaganda, but through direct experience. Black officers conducted mathematical calculations for supply distributions. Black medics diagnosed complex medical conditions. Black communications specialists repaired and operated sophisticated radio equipment. Black mechanics maintained the intricate machinery of tanks and transport vehicles. Each of these activities required intellectual abilities that Nazi ideology had specifically and repeatedly described as biologically impossible for black people. This cognitive rebuilding process was not unique to Greta or her village. Throughout the areas of Germany occupied by American forces that included black units, similar revelations were occurring. A survey conducted by Army intelligence in July 1945 would later reveal that 83% of German civilians who had regular contact with blackies. American personnel reported that the experience had significantly contradicted previous beliefs about black intellectual capabilities. The report noted with some irony that black units were inadvertently serving as particularly effective denazification agents, undermining racial ideology through daily demonstrations of its falsity. For many Germans, including Greta, these revelations extended beyond the specific issue of black intellectual capacity to undermine the credibility of the entire Nazi ideological system. If the regime had lied so comprehensively about this one aspect of reality, what other deceptions had been embedded in the worldview they had been taught? This question led many to re-examine other elements of Nazi ideology with newly skeptical eyes. By June 1945, Greta had begun working as a translator for the American headquarters established in the village's former schoolhouse. Her English had improved rapidly through daily practice, and her familiarity with local residents made her valuable for community relations. This role gave her access to a wider range of black military personnel, including specialized units with even higher concentrations of college-educated soldiers. The 92nd Signal Battalion, temporarily stationed in the area, included several men who had been electrical engineering students before the war. Sergeant William Foster had completed 3 years at Massachusetts Institute of Technology before being drafted. He maintained the division's complex communications network, a task requiring advanced knowledge of electronics, mathematics, and system design. Watching him troubleshoot a malfunctioning radio set, methodically testing components, consulting technical manuals, and implementing solutions provided concrete evidence of analytical abilities that Nazi education had explicitly claimed were biologically impossible for black individuals. Similarly, the quartermaster unit included supply officer Lieutenant Raymond Carter, who had been an economics professor at Virginia State College. Carter managed the logistics for supplying not only American troops, but also emergency civilian aid throughout the region. This required complex calculations of resource allocation, transportation efficiency, and inventory management, all tasks requiring the abstract mathematical thinking that Nazi racial theory had specifically identified as beyond black intellectual capability. For Greta, whose education had repeatedly emphasized these supposed biological limitations, watching Lieutenant Carter calculate supply requirements for 17 different distribution points, accounting for transportation constraints and spoilage rates, directly contradicted the most fundamental aspects of her racial indoctrination. This wasn't merely a matter of education. Nazi teaching had explicitly claimed that even with educational opportunity, black individuals were biologically incapable of mastering such complex mathematical operations. The abundance displayed by American forces created another form of ideological challenge. Throughout the war, Nazi propaganda had emphasized German technological and industrial superiority, claiming that American production capacity was undermined by racial diversity in its workforce. Germans had been taught that factories with black workers produced inferior products in smaller quantities than racially homogeneous German facilities. Yet the evidence before their eyes told a different story. American military units displayed an abundance that seemed almost deliberately wasteful to Germans, accustomed to years of carefully managed scarcity. Vehicles were abandoned if repairs would take too long, with new replacements arriving promptly. Ration supplies exceeded consumption, with excess often distributed to civilians or sometimes simply discarded. Ammunition was expended in training at rates that German officers would have considered profligate. This material abundance directly contradicted Nazi claims about American productive capacity and, by extension, about the capabilities of its diverse workforce. When Greta asked Lieutenant Morris about this apparent wastefulness, his explanation revealed yet another dimension of the reality hidden by propaganda. America produced over 300,000 aircraft during the war, he explained, and nearly 87,000 tanks. Many of those production lines included black workers at every level, from assembly to engineering. The factory that built this Jeep, he said, patting the hood of a nearby vehicle, employed over 7,000 black workers in Detroit, many in skilled positions. This information contradicted specific claims in Nazi educational materials, which had asserted that American industry relied on black workers only for the most menial tasks, and that this limited their productive capacity. The reality that black Americans had filled skilled manufacturing positions throughout the war industries represented another direct challenge to the factual basis of Nazi racial ideology. As summer progressed, the accumulated contradictions between Nazi teaching and observed reality created a profound psychological crisis for many Germans, including Greta. This wasn't simply a matter of accepting that they had been misinformed about one specific aspect of reality. The systematic nature of Nazi racial indoctrination meant that accepting the falsehood of its claims about black intellectual capacity necessarily undermined the entire ideological structure of National Socialism, which had placed racial hierarchy at its core. This process of ideological collapse accelerated as American occupation forces established more permanent administrative structures. Black officers and enlisted personnel filled roles at every level of the military government, from engineering and medical services to administrative and educational positions. Their daily performance of duties that required sophisticated training and intellectual capability provided ongoing evidence against Nazi racial classifications. Particularly significant was the establishment of education programs for German children. Captain Marcus Peterson, drawing on his pre-war experience as a school principal, organized classes taught by qualified soldiers. These included mathematics instruction by Sergeant Paul Robinson, who had been pursuing a doctorate in physics before being drafted, and English language lessons by Corporal James Baldwin, who had been an English literature student at New York University. Watching these men demonstrate advanced knowledge and effective teaching techniques provided daily evidence against Nazi claims about black intellectual limitations. For German children, less thoroughly indoctrinated than their parents, acceptance of this new reality came relatively easily. They responded to the quality of instruction rather than the race of the instructor. For adults like Greta, the process was more complex, requiring the dismantling of beliefs that had been systematically constructed through years of coordinated messaging across every information channel. By late summer 1945, Greta had become a regular participant in the evening discussion groups organized by Lieutenant Morris. These informal seminars, initially focused on practical English language skills, had evolved to include discussions of literature, history, and current events. Participants included both American personnel and local Germans, creating opportunities for cross-cultural exchange that would have been unimaginable months earlier. During one such discussion focused on educational systems, Morris described the network of historically black colleges and universities in the United States. These institutions were created because mainstream universities excluded black students, he explained. Howard University, where I studied, has produced thousands of black physicians, attorneys, engineers, and educators since its founding in 1867. The existence of these institutions, their longevity, academic standards, and graduate outcomes presented particularly compelling evidence against Nazi racial theories. These weren't isolated individuals achieving despite supposed biological limitations. They represented systematic intellectual accomplishment across generations and across fields of study. The implications were clear. If thousands of black Americans were successfully completing advanced degrees decades before the war, the entire premise of biological intellectual limitations was demonstrably false. For Greta, whose education had repeatedly emphasized the scientific basis of Nazi racial categories, this revelation was particularly significant. She had been taught that racial intellectual hierarchies were established scientific facts, as objectively real as chemical elements or mathematical principles. The evidence before her now suggested that these facts were deliberate fabrications constructed for political purposes rather than derived from objective observation. This realization prompted her to question other aspects of what she had been taught as scientific truth. If racial hierarchies were fictional, what about other elements of Nazi ideology presented as biological facts? The process of questioning expanded from specific claims about black intellectual capacity to the entire framework of Nazi racial science. By September 1945, when the division received orders to relocate, the transformation in the village was remarkable. The former Nazi Party headquarters now served as a community center and library, with books in English and German available for borrowing. Regular English classes continued, taught by German residents who had developed sufficient proficiency. Children played basketball on a court constructed by the engineering unit, using techniques taught by soldiers who had played college basketball before the war. More significant than these physical changes was the psychological transformation. The elaborate structure of racial beliefs, carefully constructed through years of systematic indoctrination, had collapsed for many villagers. This collapse extended beyond specific beliefs about black Americans to undermine the credibility of the entire Nazi worldview. If the regime had lied so comprehensively about this aspect of reality, what other deceptions had been embedded in their teaching? For Greta personally, the transformation was profound. On the day before the division's departure, she approached Lieutenant Morris with a request that would have been unimaginable months earlier: information about educational opportunities in the United States. "I want to understand how systems of belief are constructed and maintained," she explained. "If I could be convinced of something so fundamentally wrong despite considering myself intelligent, I need to understand how this happens." Morris provided her with information about application procedures for American universities, noting that several had established special programs for qualified European students interested in studying in the United States after the war. "The ability to question what you've been taught is the beginning of real education," he told her. Many people never develop that capacity. In the years following the war, Greta's experience would prove to be far from unique. Thousands of Germans who had direct contact with black American personnel reported similar transformative experiences. A study conducted by American occupation authorities in 1947 found that Germans in areas where black units had been stationed showed significantly lower rates of racial prejudice than those in areas occupied exclusively by white troops, suggesting that direct experience had been more effective in countering Nazi racial ideology than formal denazification programs. The long-term impact extended beyond individual attitudes. In the post-war years, several German universities established research programs examining the construction and maintenance of the Nazi belief system, with particular attention to the techniques used to establish fictional racial hierarchies as apparent scientific facts. Some of this research was conducted by former Nazi youth like Greta, who brought personal experience to their academic examination of indoctrination processes. For black American veterans, the experience of serving as living contradictions to Nazi propaganda created a painful irony upon their return to the United States. Many who had been treated with newfound respect in occupied Germany found themselves again facing segregation and discrimination at home. Lieutenant William Morris, who had commanded white German prisoners and administered occupied villages, returned to Washington, D.C., where he could not dine in certain restaurants or stay in certain hotels. This contradiction did not go unnoticed by German observers. Letters from Germans to their former occupiers sometimes expressed confusion or outrage upon learning of American segregation practices. Having accepted the evidence of their own experience over Nazi propaganda, they now found it difficult to understand why Americans themselves hadn't reached the same conclusions about the fictional nature of racial hierarchies. The story of Greta Hoffman and Lieutenant Morris represents one small example of a larger historical process: the collapse of an artificially constructed worldview when confronted with contradictory reality. Nazi racial ideology had been built through years of coordinated messaging across education, media, and social institutions. Its dismantling occurred not primarily through counter-propaganda, but through direct experience that made its falsity self-evident. In 1962, Greta Hoffmann-Weber, by then a professor of sociology at the University of Munich, specializing in propaganda studies, would publish a memoir titled when the enemies became human. In it, she wrote, "The most effective form of indoctrination convinces its subjects that they are simply perceiving objective reality rather than an artificially constructed worldview. Its most effective counter is not argument but experience that makes the construction visible." For me and many others, that experience came when we discovered that everything we had been taught about an entire group of people was demonstrably, undeniably false. Once that foundation cracked, the entire structure of beliefs became suspect. The encounters between rural Germans and educated Black American personnel in the closing months of World War II and the subsequent occupation represent a largely overlooked aspect of the post-war denazification process. While formal programs attempted to reshape German thinking through explicit instruction, some of the most profound transformations occurred through these unplanned interactions that directly contradicted the core racial components of Nazi ideology. When propaganda met reality in the form of Lieutenant William Morris reading Goethe in the original German, the carefully constructed belief system began its inevitable collapse, undermined not by counter-arguments, but by the evidence of lived experience.